Okay, let it be. Uh, Good morning, one and all. It's my warm privilege to deliver a session on design thinking and innovation. Thanks, Dr. Ranjit Singh, for inviting me. So, as Dr. Ranjit Singh has rightly introduced, my core area of specialization is services marketing, but innovation is one of the critical part we are looking into, and that is how we are looking into combination of design thinking and innovation. Till now, we were talking about design thinking for innovation, and today we have started talking about design thinking and innovation. Reason being is both are going hand in hand together. Both are considered now as the two sides of one single coin. So, I mean, it's a new tool relatively when we look at it in terms of innovation, but it's a very prevalent and a very common tool which is now used when we are looking in terms of the design thinking. So it's one of the very popular social technological tool if we look at in terms of the design thinking, and it has the potential to do for innovation exactly what TQM did for the manufacturing. And if we all remember in 1980s, the TQM total quality management concept start working into, and we look at in terms of becoming it as a popular tool, which and it was not an individual tool in itself, it was a set of tools. Like for example, some of the common ways used in TQM were the Kanban cards, QFD, quality circles, and so on and so forth. Same is happening with the design thinking. So it's a collection of various tools which we are using in terms of understanding the innovation, how it leads to the innovation, why it has become an important component when we are looking in terms of the innovations. So the basic idea is design thinking is more human-centered approach, and it unleashes the people's creative energies. The one of the important aspect of design thinking is that it helps in winning the commitment of the employees, the teams, as well as the customers. It's a combination of both, because when you're looking in terms of innovation, obviously it has to be customer centered innovations, what customers are looking for, what we need to do. So that is how we are looking into, and also it helps in radical improvement processes. So when we are looking in terms of the design thinking and innovation, before we move, let's look at in terms of what exactly the design thinking is. So as I've told you, it's the one of the human-centered approach to innovate, and when we are looking in terms of understanding the customer's need, it requires rapid prototyping and generating the ideas more creatively than what we used to have a usual way of creating the ideas. And obviously, yes, brainstorming is one of the important component of the design thinking. So the idea is we transform the way we develop our products, services, processes, and organizations, keeping in mind the customer's needs, what customers' requirements are, how we need to look it into. So that is what we are looking in terms of when we are talking about the design thinking. So we are looking in terms of typically looking at the unmet and the unarticulated needs of the customers. The idea is we minimize the uncertainty and risk of innovation by engaging the customers or the users through a series of prototypes to learn, test, and refine the concepts. So when we are looking in terms of the design thinking, some of the common tools which are used in this design thinking are ethnographic research, where we reframe the problems and experimentation is done. And another important tool of design thinking is use of the diverse teams. Design thinking is not an individual activity, it's a group activity, it's a team activity, and we need to have a collaboration between different teams from different areas. It's not that, for example, if we are talking in terms of innovating certain product or a service, we need to look only from the marketing area or only from the operations area. Actually, we require a multidisciplinary, multifunctional team. So it normally has the people from all functional areas in an organization, be it marketing, human resource, finance, operations, and so on and so forth. So that is what we are looking into. But there is a caution with respect to design thinking, as is the name itself tells that we are thinking the design. and we are looking at for the innovations. That's why the term design thinking has been done, and it has become very popular. It was popularized by the Stanford University. The first concept of design thinking came way back from Stanford University, and they have a dedicated school for the design thinking, and they popularly call it as the D school. So a lot of concepts have been evolved for design thinking. A lot of theories have evolved with respect to design thinking from there. So when we are looking in terms of design thinking, we are looking in terms of when the design thinking is appropriate, when to go for the linear analytic way of thinking, how the differences are going to make a difference. So we need to answer certain questions. If the problem is human centered, then design thinking is appropriate, because we need to have a deep understanding of the actual people. By actual people, we are talking about the users and the end customers which are involved. But if when we are looking at, excuse me, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. So when we look at in terms of the linear analytic method of innovation, again, where very few human beings are involved in the problem, it's more like when we are looking in terms of pure tech-based solutions. So then we go for the linear analytic method of the innovation. Again, the second question is when we look at in terms of how clearly we understand the problem itself. And this is it's a very critical question. Most of the times the things goes wrong when we don't understand the problem clearly. So where we need to explore a lot, we need to experiment, we need to agree, we need to do lot of brainstorming, we need to come out with the original ideas. Design thinking is the best approach for the innovation. While if we look at in terms of we understand the problem clearly and we know how to solve it, so we go for the linear analytic method. Also, when we look at in terms of the level of uncertainty, so again, yes, with innovation, there is always uncertainty, there is always risk, but design thinking is appropriate when we are looking in terms of unknowns like large or small or the past data, which is unlikely to help us. While the linear analytic approach will be good when we look at in terms of we can predict the future because we have the data, clear-cut data with us, and we can work on the data and we can look at in terms. And so when we talk about the data, so for design thinking, normally we say we have very less relevant existing data because we are trying to create something new. And for linear analytic, there is always clear sources or the analogous data available. So when we look at in terms of the design thinking, as I've told you, it's more when we are looking in terms of it's a human-centered approach. It's more of the options-focused approach. It's the possibility-driven approach, and it's always iterative. Why we are talking about the iterative here is that we cannot go by the stringent way that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. We have to look at in terms of different iterations. Suppose we have to arrive at 4. We have to look at different methods. How can we can arrive at 4? It can be 1 plus 1 plus 1. It can be 1 plus 3, 3 plus 1, and so on and so forth. So that is how we are going to, and maybe let's say 5 minus 1 also, or 6 minus 2 also. So that is how we are looking into. So the basic idea is that we cannot move away from being human, and that's why the beauty of design thinking used for innovation is that it's always considered as a human-centered approach. And we are looking in terms of the possibility, how we are going to look at in terms of delivering the design thinking. So when we look at in terms of the human-centered approach, and when we are looking in terms of being it iterative, we need to have a different mindset for the innovation, and we call it as a design thinking mindset. Now, before we begin, there are 4 whats we need to answer, and we will elaborate little later about this if time persists. We look at in terms of what is, what if, what wows, and what works. And I think all these 4 questions makes a sense. What is that customers are looking for or the users are looking for? What are their needs? How we need to move ahead? What are the requirements? How we should go for it? What are the different ways? So that is what we are looking in terms of what is. What if, again, we are looking in terms of the risk and the uncertainty. We are looking in terms of different ways. What wows is that what exceeds the experience of the customers or the users. How we are looking in terms of moving beyond what is obvious, what excites the users, and not only the user, but what excites the team also who are behind the innovation. So that is what we look at in terms of the what wows. And what works is that what ideas or what collaborations or what systems, what prototype is going to work when we are looking in terms of the design thinking. So that is what we look at in terms of the mindset for the innovation. Now, when we look at in terms of all three are very obvious: what if, what was, and what works. When we look at in terms of what is design thinking, what is the mindset for the innovation, what is design thinking best used for, we need to look at in terms of lot of answers for these. Now some of these can be, there is a list if you look at in terms of, but some of the common if you look at in terms of when you have to redefine the values. And when I'm talking about the values, we are looking in terms of the value chain within the product or the services or within the organization, values within the team members, values what customers are looking for, values what your product or your services dictate. So that is what we are looking in terms of the redefining values. Then what is one of the important component, and time and again we keep on repeating, is the human-centered innovation. So how we are bringing all thinking from, it's something like wearing the customers or the user's shoes and trying to understand what size fits the customers. It's not that one size fits all. So that is what we are looking in terms of the human-centered innovation. Then what is also looked in terms of the quality of life. And why quality of life, why are we talking about? Because a lot of innovations are required to improve upon the quality of the life, be it the healthcare innovations, be it the innovations in terms of the services, be it in the innovations in terms of offering what is good for the customers, be it in terms of offering just a simple experience to the customer. So that is what we are looking in terms of the quality of life. Then we also look at in terms of problems affecting the diverse group of the people. So we look at in terms of how we can solve the problems. We are looking for the solutions. We are looking in terms of different approaches of looking at the solutions. So that is what we are looking in terms of how we affect the diverse group of the people. Then we involve multiple systems. It's not about one, as I've told you, we are talking about the multidisciplinary approach. We are talking in terms of the multifunctional approach. So we have to look at in terms of the involving the multiple systems. Along with this, we also need to focus on the shifting of marketing and the behaviors. We also look at in terms of the social and the marketing changes taking place, or the market changes takes place, because today there are rapid changes taking place, be it the social changes, be it the market changes. So a lot of needs is there where we look at in terms of the shifting in terms of marketing and behavior. And I think the recent era which we are going through, the pandemic era, we all have a live example that we require a different way, different system, different behavior altogether, and we all are trying to cope with it in the best manner. So that is what we are looking in terms of the coping with the rapid social and the market changes, or shifting the market and the behaviors of the human being. Also, it involves the issues with the new technology. So when we are looking in terms of addressing, when we are looking in terms of representing the new technologies, new ways, design thinking is one of the best approach when it is considered. And since we all know the change of pace of innovation is very fast, so we have to cope with that pace also. And the design thinking and innovation helps us together to cope with the changing pace of the innovations. Then it also helps in terms of the entrepreneurial initiatives. As we know nowadays, we are moving more and more towards entrepreneurship. There is both intrapreneurship and entrepreneurship. Both are moving ahead. We are looking in terms of both the aspects. So we have to look at in terms of all these aspects, and that is how we are looking in terms of the what is design thinking and what is the mindset for the innovation. And also one of the important aspects is, apart from others, is the how we can use it for the educational advances. One of the very important component when we are looking in terms of the design thinking. So when we are looking in terms of the mindset, that means we are talking about a learning mindset, a broad repertoire, and a customer empathy. And the empathy is one of the most important aspects when we are looking into. If we club these together, the learning mindset, the broad repertoire, and the customer empathy, we are getting a prepared mindset for the innovations. And not just the innovations, here we are looking in terms of using design thinking for the innovation. So that is what we are looking in terms of how we are moving ahead with the mindset for the innovations in terms of learning mindset, broad repertoire, customer empathy, and so on so forth. So these are very important aspects when we are looking into, and we have to go by the mindset. It is not, as I'm telling, told earlier also, I'm telling again also, it's not a linear approach. So reason being is there is lot of you need to go back, you need to do lot of changes, you need to understand what goes wrong, have we started with the wrong ideas, or how we are going to move into, or what are the risks, what are the feasibilities, what are the availabilities available. So that is what we need to look at in terms of when we are talking about the mindset for the innovation. uh, what is required, why we are talking about a prepared mind here, is because we need to have the lot of exercise for the imaginations. Now, what happens is when we look at in terms of the uh, looking in terms of when we say the imagination, and especially as I've told earlier also, we are trying to unleash the creativity of the teams, because only then we can have the more and more imagination. We have to go beyond the box thinking, so out of box thinking or something more beyond that. Sometimes a simple thing triggers and can be converted into a big idea and a big solution. So that is what we are looking into. But we have to be little cautious about when we are talking about, though, I mean, yes, you require a lot of training of the teams and all that. You need to sit together, you need to solve your differences within the teams and all that. But there is sometimes what happens is when we go for the design thinking, and since it's a human centered approach, there is sometimes the subtler way of thinking. I do it my way only, and this doesn't work in design thinking. You have to move beyond your way, you have to adopt somebody else's way, or you have to adopt the team's way. So that's a, you need to move away from that subtler way of thinking. Then sometimes it is also affected by the human biases, which is very commonness. And when we say the human biases, one of the common biases which we look at in terms of our rootedness to the status quo, each one of our resistance towards the change. So if we are resisted towards the change, then it becomes a lot of issues, lot of problem for us. So we need to move beyond the human biases. We have to leave all the biases aside and then only look at in terms of how we prepare our mind towards the innovation. And another thing is there is always the attachment to the specific behavior norms. I again say, well, like say I only do it this way, or this is the only correct way, this is the right way. And we again need to move beyond this, because if you look at in terms of these three aspects, which we call as the subtler way of thinking, the human biases, or the attachments to the specific behavior, these all block the exercise of the imagination. And design thinking and innovation is more about the imagination, it's more about the creativity, it's more about the empathy. So that is what we have to look at in terms of, and that's why we say we need to build up a mindset for the innovation when we are using the design thinking as an approach for the innovations. So when we look at in terms of moving further with respect to the different aspects and different ways of looking in terms of the mindset for the innovation, so typically we can look at in terms of the 6 elements of the mindset for design thinking, or for using the design thinking for the innovation. First, obviously, think and act in a human centered way. We all are humans, we all are consumers, we all are users. So what best suits us? as an organization, as a team, we need to look at in terms of not just act as a robot, not just act as a machine, look at in terms of human and think and act in a human centered way. Then obviously we have to collaborate in the diverse teams. One team won't work. Same functional areas won't work. We have to look at in terms of, and if we collaborate into the diverse teams, half of the subtler way of thinking, human biases and the specific behaviors goes away, because then we open up to the others ideas also, and we open up to the new imaginations also. So we have to collaborate into the diverse teams. We have to explore the problem space. What is the problem? How we can look at in terms of, and also sometimes we need to explore why this problem has caused. What is the reason behind the problem? What we are looking for? So you have to explore the problem space. Then you learn through the experimentation. Lot of experimentations are done in design thinking. It's not that today you tell that, okay, I have to come out with this idea and tomorrow you start implementing it. It doesn't be in this way. So we have to go with lot of experimentations, and that's why we say we have to move away from the rigidity, and it is more of an iterative process, because we have to go back, we have to look at in terms of how we are moving ahead, how the things go further, how we are going to experiment, look at in terms of what experiments we are going to do. It may be the ethnographic experiments also, it can be the reframing of the problem. So when we look at in terms of the reframing, maybe we look at in terms of looking at different ways. The way which we look traditionally may not work. So we look at from different lenses, different angles, and we look at in terms of understanding how we are going to reframe our problems. Then we also look at in terms of embracing the uncertainty. Now, with design thinking or with innovation, any innovation, there is lot of uncertainties always there. So when we look at in terms of the aspects with respect to the mindset, obviously we have to look at in terms of the uncertainty. Uncertainty can be in any way. Uncertainty in terms of the teams, uncertainty in terms of the human thinking, uncertainty in terms of the behavior, uncertainty in terms of the social causes, uncertainty in terms of the changes, environmental changes, financial changes, resource changes. Anyway, we can look at in terms of the uncertainty, and thus we need to embrace the uncertainty. We are not going to get the obvious. So we have to look at in terms. And then we look at in terms of envisioning a radical new future, which may change not necessarily the entire world, but may change the organizational thinking, may change the team's thinking, may change the user's experience, may change the functionality of the teams, and so on and so forth. So that is what we are looking into. Now, again, lot of things have been told that when we look at in terms of design thinking, it's more effective with respect to the incremental innovations. We normally talk about the incremental innovations, but believe me or not, we can equally use it for the frugal innovations. And as we know, we as a country are more known for the frugal innovations. So both goes hand in hand, the innovations and the design thinking goes hand in hand, be it the incremental innovations or be it the frugal innovations which are coming into the map. So we are looking in terms of moving ahead. So typically always keep in mind that we are looking in terms of 6 different elements when it comes to the mindset, using the design thinking for the innovation. One, we think and act in a human-centered way. We have to collaborate in the diverse teams. We have to explore the problem space. We have to learn through the experimentation. We have to embrace the uncertainty, and we have to envision a radically new future. So, So when we look at in terms of, if you remember, I initially talked about what is, what if, what was, what works, etc. So typically we are looking in terms of 10 stages when we are talking about the design thinking. We are looking starting from the visualization, then we go to the journey mapping, then we go to the value chain analysis, and then we look at in terms of the mind mapping. So if we look at in terms of overall visualization, we are looking in terms of how it's moving, how we need to look at in terms of moving further, how we are looking in terms of the moving ahead with respect to the innovations. or using the design thinking as an innovation. So in what we do is we look at in terms of the design brief. We look at in terms of the project descriptions. We look at in terms of the concept. We look at in terms of the scope. We raise lot of questions. Then we look at in terms of how we can plan with the ideas, how we go with the brainstorming sessions, what outcomes we are expecting, and what we are looking in terms of the success, and how we are going for the further planning. So that's why we say when we look at in terms of what is, we are more focusing on the journey, a journey mapping of consumers. We are looking in terms of more value chain analysis, and we are looking in terms of the mind mapping. Now coming to the next, when we talk about the what if is mainly we are looking in terms of starting from brainstorming to the concept development. And what if is always trying to answer the risks attached to it, or the uncertainty attached to the innovations. So when we look at it in terms of the what if, we primarily focus on the design criteria. We look at it in terms of what are the goals which are required to be addressed, who are the participants, who are the users, who is going to there, what attributes we are looking for, and what are the what in terms of attributes, we can look at in terms of both the physical attributes as well as the functional attributes, and we also look at in terms of the constraints. So this is all what we need to look at in terms of the design criteria. uh, we also look at in terms of the what wows. So when we talk about the what wows, we are looking in terms of the assumptions. We look at in terms of the prototypes. So what is going to help the customers, what or the users, what wows the customers, what they are looking into, what they are going to experience into. So when we look at in terms of the experience, in terms of giving the experience, we have to go by the testing. And if we don't go, we have done the development, concept development till what if, and if we don't prototype and we don't test those, that is not going to affect. So rapid prototyping is one of the integral part when we are looking into. So what happens is we start giving some name to the concept which we are looking in terms of the ideas and the things which we are looking at. Then we also look at in terms of the how we are going to pitch it. So we look at in terms of identifying and giving the detail of the needs of the users, the customers, what needs they are looking into, what are their requirements. We look at in terms of the different approaches, how we can approach. If we have to reframe the problem, we reframe the problem. We look at in terms of how is the best way to approach, or what can be the multiple ways of approaching to the customers. We also look at in terms of the benefits, what benefits we collaboratively can get. And when we say we collaboratively get, we are talking about the organization, the teams, as well as the users. So obviously we are looking in terms of the end idea is that you should be able to enhance the experience of the users. You can able to solve the problems of the users. So that is also not only looking in terms of the implementation, but it's also looking in terms. It also look at in in terms of how we are moving ahead, how we are looking in terms of testing. It can be a pre-testing, pre-experiment, or it can be pre-experience, or it can be a learning interactions. Anything can be there when we look at in terms of the what works. So basically, we can also call it as the learning guide. So here we look at in terms of what we were before and what we are after. How we can look at in terms of, so obviously, in short, we need to have some strategic guidelines. We need to look at in terms of understanding the key assumptions, which are very important, which needs to be tested, which has been tested, and how you're creating the value for the customers. And we also look at in terms of the market testing, and obviously we have to look at in terms of the financial capitals to be expected. So because without finance we cannot move ahead. So what in return as an organization we are looking for. So that is what we are looking at in terms of importantly when we are talking in terms of the things. So right from the journey mapping to learning the launch, it's all about the visualization. How we visualize the problem, how we look at in terms of the brainstorming, how we come out with the ideas, how we implement those ideas, how we test and prototype those ideas, and how we co-create the values. So that is what we are looking into. And if we talk about in terms of the entire value chain which we are looking into, and if you look at in terms of, there is a deliberate reason why it has been made in the ways. Because it works in different ways. It doesn't work in a linear fashion. Design thinking never works in a linear fashion. So we have to look at it in terms of how it is working, how it's moving ahead, how we are going ahead with the ideas, how we are developing the things. So we have to look at in terms of the all aspects. So what if we have to look at in terms of visualization, we are visualizing four major things. We are visualizing the brief about the design. We are looking in terms of the criteria for the innovations. We are looking in terms of the picking the innovations, and then we are using it as a learning guide. So that is what we are looking in terms of when it comes to the design innovation or the design thinking for the innovations and the innovations together. Okay. So as I have told you, when we are looking in terms of clubbing together the design thinking and the innovation, we know we have the uncertainty, we have the patterns, we have the insights, and we need to move towards the clarity or the focus. So when we look at in terms of the entire journey, if we look at in terms of using the design thinking and the innovation, there is always an uncertainty where we look at in terms of the research. The research leads us towards certain concept, and when we start getting with respect to the concept, when we start getting some clarity, we start getting some focus, we move towards the design, and that design is actually we are coming out of the innovations. So when we look at in terms of clubbing the design thinking and innovation together, we are talking about three aspects: the human aspect, the technological aspect, and the business aspect. Human aspect is more looking in terms of the desirability. The technological aspect is more looking in terms of the feasibility, and we all know it is not going to work if our concepts or if our ideas are not feasible. And feasible in all sense, not only in the technological sense, but in all sense we are looking in terms of the feasibility. And in terms of the business, ultimately the organizations go for the design thinking and the innovation because they have to do the business, and it has to be a viable business. It cannot be a loss-making business. Initially you can be a loss making, but ultimately you have to see the future, and that's why we say we have to look at in terms of the what rapid future we are looking in terms of what incremental benefits we are going to look at into. So we are looking in terms of the human desirability, we are looking in terms of the technology, we are looking in terms of the business viability. So when we move further with respect to these, the desirability, technology, and the business, we have to look at in terms of how we bring it together. And that's why if you see this is more interrelated. If you can look at this is what we are saying. We have interrelated activities: the human desirability, the technological feasibility, and the business viability. All these are the interrelated activities, and that's why we are focusing on the innovation here. So we look at in terms of from a human point of view, with what is technologically feasible and what is economically or business wise viable. That is what we are looking into. So we are bringing three things together the human perspective, the technological perspective, and the business or the economic perspective together. So when we are talking about disability, obviously we mean what makes sense to the people and for people. If it doesn't make sense, if we are not able to make an answer for this, it doesn't make sense to go for the innovation at all. So you have to look at in terms of what makes sense to the people and for people, and how we are moving ahead with respect to the design thinking and the innovation. When we are talking about the feasibility with respect to the technology, that means whether it's technologically possible and within the foreseeable future. Why we are talking about foreseeable future? Obviously, design thinking is more future oriented approach. It's not present oriented approach. And when we say future oriented approach, it's not that we start today and we start looking, okay, after 20 years, what will happen? No, we have to look at in terms of the next future. Next future is maybe the next year or the next cycle or the next phase. So we have to look at in terms of the foreseeable future. So we have to look at in terms of whether it's feasible technically or not, whether it's possible technically or not. And then we look at in terms of the viability. So we look at in terms of whether it becomes a sustainable business model or not. So every business is looking in terms of the sustainability. Every business looks in terms of the growth. Every business looks at in terms of the profitability. Every business looks in terms of creating the value. And if we put it in a very shortest way of value, obviously as customers, we can give different names to the values. It can be a financial value, it can be the epistemic value, it can be the social value, it can be the psychological value and all that. But to club together, to make understand in a simple way as an organization, we need to understand, and which we need to make customers also understand, is when we are talking about the value, we are looking in terms of benefits minus outlays. What benefits the consumers or the users are going to get for what they are paying for. Paying for may not necessarily only in terms of the monetary payment, but it can be also in terms of the non-monetary payment. So we look at in terms of like time, or we look at in terms of the faith, we look at in terms of the trust. So what we can talk it in terms of the intangible aspects, not only the tangible outlays, but also the intangible outlays. And many people say, and many researchers believe rather, that design thinking is one approach for the innovation where we make the intangibles into the tangibles. So that is what we are trying to look at in terms of the viability. It's more than creating the products and the services. It's more applied to the systems, procedures, protocols, and the experiences. So that is why we say today it's the high time when we are talking about the innovations. We are looking in terms of the innovations. We need to look at in terms of, and that's why we keep on focusing on two major tools of the design thinking which we are using for the innovation. One is the ethnographic research and another is the diverse teams. So these two goes hand in hand when we are talking about, and that is what we look at in terms of the aspects with respect to design thinking and innovation. Now, this is one of the most common framework with respect to the design thinking which is used for the innovation. So, and if you look at in terms of the important aspect of this approach of using the innovation is to have empathy. So we look at in terms of, and that's why we keep on talking about innovation, which is human centered. We empathize. So it actually what happens is it collaborates the context with the form. So we look at in terms of the empathizing, then we ideate, where we look at in terms of there is clash of ideas happening, number of the ideas going to take place. We look at in terms of how we are giving birth to the innovations. Once the ideas are there, we need to prototype. We need to bring these ideas to life. We need to bring it into the working models, and then these ideas need to be tested. So it should be refined properly, how it's going to work in a better fashion. And then we have to define that whether it is going to solve a problem or not. So if you look at in terms of it's a cyclical and recyclical process when we are looking in terms of the design thinking. And this is the most common framework which we use. Some people call it as the steps for the innovation when we are using the design thinking. Some people call it as the 5 steps of design thinking innovation framework. So these are very common steps which are used. We will elaborate little more on this when we are talking about. So always remember, when we are saying using the design thinking, we are talking about 5 aspects: empathize, ideate, prototype, test, and define. So when we look at in terms of phases of design thinking and innovation, the first phase is frame a question. Now, frame a question means when we are saying, if you remember, if you look at in terms of, we have 5 whats which we try to look at in terms of what is, what if, what was, what works, and what will happen. So that is what we are looking in terms of. So we have to frame a question. We need to inspire our teams to think about the customers or the users. We need to have a designing solution and what actually they are requiring. It can be different types of the needs when we are looking in terms of, but we have to look at in terms of these aspects. Then we have to gather the inspiration. Now again we have to, sometimes it says that ideas, normally one idea comes from the another idea. So one idea lead to another idea, and sometimes like for example, if I give, all of us are now well aware about Ola and Uber. Now how these come about? The idea came about, okay, I need a taxi service. I need a rental taxi service, and this is how we are going to look it into. And from this another idea, business idea propagated, okay, I need a rental car, but I don't need it with a chauffeur. I wanted to have an experience of driving it myself. And that's how a new business idea came into, where we are looking in terms of moving ahead. So we have to gather the inspiration, we have to look around. Many a time the inspiration is sitting next to us. Only thing is we have to look at the opportunity. Most of us actually miss this opportunity. We only focus. We are so focused that we don't look around and we forget to seek the inspiration. So lot of inspirations and lot of ideas actually are coming by observing and discovering what people are actually requiring for, what they are looking for. It may be very simple, small thing. So that is what we are looking into. Once we gather the inspiration, the third phase is we have to generate the ideas. So we use the inspiration to push past the obvious, and we need to come out with the fresh solutions to our problems. We need to come out with the new ideas. We need to generate the fresh ideas. And generating ideas is not an easy job. The maximum time in, if you look at in terms of, time, maximum, they look at, okay, well, some are good ideas, some are bad ideas. All that is of the uh, moving. So we spend months into the generation of the ideas. We start putting into the baskets. The best way of when we getting the idea is one of the way. Another way which I will think when we do the ideas, in place and look the so terms so and start working on, start putting it on the paper, design around types, it's working. So idea. So idea something to bring that of the other so that others can also see of the prototype of yours. Then you test again with respect to back, we look it in terms. So we have to look at prototypes. The prototypes, if the prototypes itself is not working or it doesn't seem to be feasible or it's too risky, then it doesn't make sense to move ahead and go for the innovation. So that is what we are looking in terms of when we are talking about the prototypes. And with the prototypes, sometimes we also test these prototypes it can be a lab test or it can be a test within the panels, within the selected consumers, within the selected markets. So you look at in terms and you try to get the feedback. Sometimes the ideas may come that with the prototypes, other ideas may come that what changes are required, what further things needs to be done. So you look at in terms and that's why we always talk about the iteration. So whatever changes are required, go for the iteration, go for it. I mean, don't be resistant that okay, this is the best thing which I have come out, because as an organization we normally think this is the best solution which I have come across, but may not necessarily, the users may not be necessarily thinking in that way. So you need to be open for the iteration. And the best thing is you go for the sharing the story. So two important aspects when we look at in terms of the design, using the design thinking as a tool for the innovation is one, you have arrived at the right solution, you can craft, now you share the story, introduce it to your colleagues, clients, customers, users, markets, etc., and also you give a visualization to each of them. So you give a visualization of your concepts, of your ideas, what it is going on, how it needs to move. So that is what we are looking into. So when we look at in terms of the phases, again, always keep in mind these may work. Sometimes it's not necessarily that it again goes into a linear fashion. Suppose we have reached at the generation of the ideas and again we need to go back to framing a question. If we have not framed a right question, we are moving in a wrong direction. So sometimes we need to go back to the framing the question situation also, or sometimes we need to go back to the inspiration also. So we have to look at it in terms of, and the idea behind the design thinking is that you are very open to everything. You are not stringent, you are not rigid. You are looking in terms of different changes, how it's bringing out. So that's why we say it's not a linear process. It's always a non-linear iterative process that teams use to understand the users. They challenge each other's assumptions. They redefine the problems. They create the innovative solutions for prototyping and testing. So we look at it in terms of all these, and these helps us in tackling the problems. These problems, if the problems are ill-defined or are unknown, we reach to a defined problems or we reach to the known problems through these phases. When we emphasize, when we define, when we ideate, when we prototype, and when we test. So that is what we are looking in terms of things. So when we are talking about these phases of looking in terms of empathize, obviously we have to understand the needs of and the impacts of the end user, and this is the most beautiful aspect of the design thinking, and that's why when we say it's a human centered, why we call it as human centered is because it empathizes with the requirements, with the needs, with the impacts it's going to make. Define is we reframe and we clarify the problems, we relook from different angles, we look it in terms of different aspects. Ideate is where we look it in terms of generating creative ideas through brainstorming sessions, through different ways. Then when we look at in terms of hands-on approach, by rapid prototyping, we go for the prototyping and then we develop and implement the identified solutions and assess the results. So that is what we are looking in terms of these different phases. Now, before we move further with respect to the phases of design thinking and innovation is, The idea, when we are looking in terms of the design thinking, there is obviously an understanding. Obviously, you're learning a lot about the innovation, and lot of aspects of looking at innovations are there. Typically, if you look at in terms of every organization, when they are going for the innovations, they look for the three aspects, or it is said that innovations must deliver three things. The first is the superior solutions, second is lower risks and the cost of change, and third is the employee buy-in. These three are very important criteria when we are looking into, or the three important things which your innovations must lead to. Now, what we mean by these is, when we are talking about the superior solutions, we are looking in terms of defining the obvious, moving the away from the conventional ways. We have to, go beyond. It is very common as a human being, when we look at in terms of the aspects. We lead to the obvious. We look for the convenient solutions and all that. Here, what happens is, we are looking more for the original ideas. We are more looking for the action oriented ideas. We are more looking for the user driven ideas. So when we are saying the superior solutions, what we are looking at? We are looking at the diverse voices when it comes for the innovations. When we talk about the lower risk and the cost of change, so each one of us know that the uncertainty is unavoidable. We have the portfolio of the options. There is incremental innovations taking us, but what happens is, over a period of time, we kill the certain creative ideas because arguably they become more risky. So we have to be very careful when we are going for the innovation, how risk ready we are. So if we are not ready to take the risk, it doesn't make sense. Then go for the conventional way. Don't look it in terms of, or go for the obvious ways. Don't look it in terms of bringing out something new. So you look at in terms of, so the when we are talking about the lowering the risk and the cost, we are actually looking at as a trade-off between the ideas, because what happens is, somewhere over a period of time, the focus and the resources gets diluted. So we are looking in terms of the focus and resources together, and we have to look at in terms of how we are bringing it something as a portfolio of options on the table. And the third important aspect is the employee buy-in. Now, employee buy-in, why we say is, when we are talking from the design thinking perspective, we say that innovation won't succeed unless companies' employees don't get behind it. It may be in your mind, but it has to come out. It has to have certain visualization. It has to have some tangibility with it. It needs to have certain shape. So when the all employees come together, they move behind it. It leads to, it definitely generates to a lot of solutions. It definitely leads to a lot of feasibility, lot of viability, and it requires lot of support. So even support is required for generating the creative ideas. The creative ideas will not come, and we know two solid examples in front of us is Apple and the Google. How they give the teams or the employees the liberty to generate the creative ideas, and how day on day basis they are coming out with something new, with creativity, with innovations. And it's not just incremental innovations or just the transformational innovations. They are looking in terms of the creative innovations. So that is what we need to look at into. The only negative point is when we are talking in terms of the employees buy-in, because we are talking about the diversity, we are talking in terms of different set of the people working together. It might bring the chaos and the incoherence. So somewhere then it goes to your organization culture, your organization's value system, how organizations give the freedom of thoughts, freedom of working to their employees, flexibility to their employees and all that. So we are looking in terms of the efficiency, we are looking in terms of the rationality, we are looking in terms of the centralized control. And believe me, no innovation is without action. So you have to have into the action when we are looking in terms of the using the design thinking for the innovations. So when we look at in terms of, again, what we mean is, we all are designers. We need to look about the audience for whom we are designing. what we are designing, we have to observe, we have to interview, we have to reframe, we have to understand who our consumers or users are, what matters to them, what we are looking into, understanding them clearly and how it is going to impact them. We also need to look at in terms of the creating a point of view that is based on users' needs and the insights. What are their needs? We need to look at in terms of the brainstorming as ideation, come up with as many creative solutions as possible. In fact, design thinking encourages the wild ideas as well. Then we look at in terms of the representation of the ideas. We look at in terms of how I can show my idea to the others. How we look at in terms of, and that's just when we are talking about the prototype, we are just trying to give a shape to the idea. We are going to create a rough draft of the idea so that we can have a hands-on approach with respect to the idea. And then we look at in terms of sharing the prototype idea with the original user for the feedback, what worked, what didn't work, how you look at in terms of, so it's a learning process, learning and relearning process when we are looking in terms of using different phases of the design thinking. So as I've told you, it's not you are learning in a sequential way or it's a linear equation. It's not a linear equation at all. It is looking in terms of how you look at in terms of different ways, how you look at in terms of working teams parallelly, how you move out of order, what you need to repeat, so that you look at in terms of the iteration. So if you look at in terms of from, it seems obvious that from empathize we go to define, we ideate, we prototype, and then we test. But it might be a possibility from prototype we need to come back to the ideate. Sometimes from empathizing we directly go to the ideate. Sometimes from prototype testing we can go back to the defining and all that. So again we look at in terms of lot of iterations which takes place in the use of the design thinking when we are looking in terms of the innovations. We have to break the norm of being a linear and a sequential way. It is not going to work in a sequential way or in a linear way. So we need to move beyond that mindset, and that is very critical and very important aspect when we are looking into. So, and that's why we say for innovations, when we're talking about the design thinking, we are talking about three major aspects: creativity, innovation, and empathy. That means you understand your users and you design for your users. So you look at in terms of, again, it's in the same way where we are talking about, you evolve over a period of time and you look at in terms of what your users are looking for and what is needs to be done. So if you look at in terms of the creativity, innovation, and empathy over a period of time, we are primarily looking in terms of the 7 activities which comes into the picture when we look at in terms of the application of the design thinking. Each of these activity actually helps in generating a clear output that is required for the next activity, required for the fulfillment, not only the fulfillment of the next activity, but also for converting it to the another output. So in output of one becomes the input for the others, and that is how you are going to work into. So what are the 7 activities which we primarily look it into apart from what is presented in the slide is we need to look at in terms of arriving the implementable innovations. The first application of design thinking which we are looking in terms of is to arrive at the implementable innovations. Innovation can be anything, but we have to look at in terms of it should be implementable. Then we also look at in terms of the customer discovery. It helps us in understanding the customers, and that's why we talk about the journey mapping. It goes much deeper into what customers are looking for. Customers may be looking for a very smaller thing. Sometimes customers themselves or the users themselves are very confused what they are looking for. So when